Philippines in 1898 that the island finally grew into a fortress. Dewey's victory was part of the 10-week war between Spain and the United States, fought in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, and the American triumph signaled the end of the Spanish Empire and marked the United States' first steps onto the world stage. At war's end, U.S. interests spanned the globe, stretching from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to Guam and the Philippine Islands in the Pacific. The Americans saw Corregidor as more than a way station en route to Manila. The island became a sentry in the mouth of the bay on which they built Fort Mills in 1908. American engineers constructed enormous seacoast batteries atop the island's cliffs, decked out with heavy coastal guns riveted into huge concrete pits. The engineers designed the gun mounts so that they could be mechanically raised and then lowered between shots, disappearing behind thick concrete walls to protect them from naval fire. Besides batteries and fortifications, the engineers paved 65 miles of roads and trails and laid 19.5 miles of electric railroad track used to move equipment and ammunition to the different batteries that dotted the head of the island, dubbed topside. Built as a weapon of war, Fort Mills was reputed to be one of the finest forts in the Far East, both in military might and in amenities. For the American troops stationed there, it had an electric trolley system for public transport, a movie theater, a baseball field, a parade field, a swimming pool, and a 9-hole golf course. But Fort Mills, built on an ancient hunk of volcanic rock in the mouth of the bay, had grown into much more than a fort. It was a symbol of America's might in the Pacific, until the Japanese arrived. It was 1941, and the Japanese Imperial Army was on the march south with their sights set on Australia. Standing in their way was a ragtag force of American and Filipino soldiers under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the iconic general with his corncob pipe, neatly pressed uniform, and aviator sunglasses. Even before World War II, MacArthur was an American legend, a hero of the Great War, a reformer of West Point, the youngest major general in U.S. Army history, and a controversial Army Chief of Staff. After retiring in 1935, MacArthur accepted an offer to become the Philippine Army's Field Marshal, tasked with training the country's fledgling military force in advance of independence in 1946. After Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent invasion of the Philippines, MacArthur was called back to the U.S. Army to fight the Japanese. He set up his headquarters on Corregidor. For 3 months, American and Filipino soldiers fought the Japanese on Luzon's Bataan Peninsula, which lay just over 2 miles across the sea from Corregidor's imposing cliffs. MacArthur's strategy relied on reinforcements and supplies from the United States to relieve his forces both on the peninsula and on Corregidor. But thanks to the enormous strain of fighting a war on 2 fronts, Washington had declared war against Germany 3 days after the announcement to fight Japan. It could take years for American reinforcements to arrive in the Philippines. There were no reinforcements and no supplies waiting in Australia either. MacArthur and the American and Filipino soldiers in his command were on their own. In February 1942, MacArthur wired President Franklin D. Roosevelt that he and his family would share the fate of the garrison on Corregidor, which looked like either surrender or death. But Roosevelt and the Army's current Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, had other plans. At 61, MacArthur was one of the most experienced generals in the United States, especially in the Pacific, and widely viewed as the only general who knew how to beat the Japanese. Losing his leadership would be as disastrous as the attack on Pearl Harbor. Plus, MacArthur was the overwhelming choice to command Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific.